Hello everyone, welcome to this week's confirmation class. I hope you're all keeping well and enjoying doing these videos and the tasks set from them. I've had some super pictures sent in of last week's Bible story, which is how Jesus used the disciples to start what we know as the church, and Peter was the head of it, and he called Peter the rock on which he built his church. And today we're going to think about that PowerPoint presentation that I sent to your parents for you to go through, and some of the ideas that gives in how we think of the church as being both a building where people worship, but also the sense of a church being the actual people themselves. And then we'll go on to think about what it means for you to be a full member of that church, which you'll become at your service of confirmation, which we'll organise just as very soon as we can, when the bishop lays his hands on your head and we believe the Holy Spirit comes down and you become a full member of Jesus's church. I have here, first of all, the sheet that I put on the email I sent to your grown-ups, showing the different places and different items which are in church. So this is the font where people are baptised. This is called a pew, where people sit. This is a lectern, where the Bible and the lesson is read from. This is a cross, and you can see that this cross is draped with a purple sheet, which tells me that this is in the season of Lent, because we'll come on to what the different colours in the church mean. And this is an altar. This is where the priest celebrates the Eucharist, where you remember Jesus' body and blood in bread and wine. And that's what we're going to finish off with today, that story of how Jesus starts the idea of bread and wine, which we carry on in our churches today. He's a stained glass window, which you'll have seen some churches, but definitely not all churches, have in them. And this is the pulpit, where vicars sometimes stand and talk to people in what we call the sermon. Although you might have noticed I don't really use the pulpit. I stand on the steps there. I think it's much better to be closer to the people. But nevertheless, that's what this is for. It's called a pulpit, for what we call preaching the sermon, which is giving the talk after the Bible reading. So I hope you got all those right. And I'm going to show you the PowerPoint presentation now, and we'll just think about some of the different things in the ideas in that PowerPoint presentation. So this is the first slide. All these different buildings are churches, but they're all different styles, aren't they? This is more like our churches, what we're used to thinking of in England, at least, as a stone built old building. But this is a church that I've been in, actually. This is a church in South America, and you can see it's made out of corrugated iron, because I actually was fortunate enough to go to South America, and I can tell you the people in that church worship God just as much as in this fine building here. And then this is another different kind of church. It looks much more like a modern building, doesn't it? So let's move on to the next. So this is, again, two different kinds of churches, aren't they? One a very grand building, and one a very simple, small building. And you'll see that this is, in fact, Wells Cathedral in the southwest of England, built in 1175. And it's so grand because it was it's called the seat of the bishop, which is where the bishop's throne is, because it was a central building, as you can see, for all the other churches, like the mother church. But this is just as much a church. This is a very small Methodist chapel, which is another kind of church organisation, just like we're in the Church of England, the Anglican Church. The Methodist Church is another, what we call, denomination. It's very small because it served only a very small community. But again, these are two different kinds of churches, aren't they? But have you noticed they're quite similar in that they both have a dome? This is in South Africa, and people there worship in kind of modern ways, with rock music that they like, and that they don't wear special clothes. And this one is a very old church in Greece, and you can see the white and the blue represent, the blue is like the sea, isn't it? So it's fitting in with its own area, and it's white because it's very hot there, and the white reflects the sun. So moving on, this next slide, you can see this very old church here, and this is called a basilica, and it has a dome here, and it's in the shape, if you notice, of a cross. And if you look at lots of old churches, they're in the shape of the cross. This part there's called the nave, and then you have the parts that lead on to the side there, and a dome in the middle. And this part here is called the chancel, and then the very special part where the altar is here is called the sanctuary. So that's the next kind one. So if you look at many features in churches, very old churches might have these strange creatures called gargoyles, which are very sort of meant to be frightening away what people thought of as evil spirits. But yeah, you'll see actually, if you go to some cathedrals, some very old cathedrals, the people who carved these gargoyles must have had a sense of humour, because they actually carved them in the image of kind of famous people at the time, mainly people that they didn't like. And some churches have a bell tower. We know that both of our churches have a bell, which we can ring. And you'll have an opportunity in the confirmation class when we can actually meet again together to have a go at ringing our church bells. But these are other features in these churches. So we have different stained glass windows, some which tell parts of stories of Jesus's life. So this is, you can see Mary and the baby Jesus, and I think these are the three wise men. You can see this is the Last Supper, which we're going to be thinking about at the end of today's video. And this is a picture of Jesus being crucified, but you can see that behind him is God, and the glory of God's being shone around. Now I mentioned that do you remember me saying that Methodist church? These are all the different, what we call denominations. And this is our denomination. This is the Church of England, the Anglican Church, but there's lots of other organisations of Christians. So we have the Orthodox churches, which are found mainly in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, Baptist churches, which are found all over Europe and in North America, Lutheran, which is like the Church of England, but mainly found in Europe, especially in Germany, Methodist, which, where am I going? Pentecostal, which again we find in our own country, Methodist, which you've seen a picture of a Methodist church. There's Methodist chapels in Blackburn. That's Lutheran, isn't it? This is Catholic here, which is we would say in this country Roman Catholic. So we think of, say, Pleasington Priory and St Peter's in Mill Hill. They are Catholic churches. And I'll go on to explain the kind of difference between these churches at another time, but there's a sense in which the Church of England is like the Catholic Church in that we have bishops in our church, and they are the people who are at the head of the church, and that's why the bishop is coming to confirm you. That's why it's not me, because the bishop stands in a line of bishops which goes all the way back to St Peter. And that's why we think of St Peter as being the head of the church. So finally, things you might find in the church. Now, we've done a little bit of this on that worksheet. Next one, that's the altar. You can see we talked about that. Well, we have the celebrate the bread and the wine. The cross, a symbol because Jesus died on the cross. Candles, because we have them now because they represent Jesus as the light of the world, but actually people used to have them because that was the only way of lighting a church before we had electricity or gas lights. An organ, or in some churches a piano, which are used to accompany kind of traditional hymns, and sometimes we have musical instruments which we can worship God in different ways, from modern instruments like guitars or classical instruments as well. Are used in churches. So this finally, the last slide for today. This is the font where we saw on that sheet where people are baptised, mainly babies that are brought to church, but not only babies. Anyone who's not been baptised can be. Some churches have long wooden pews. Emmanuel does. Some churches have chairs. St Francis has chairs. But if you see a long bench like this, or form, people used to say in this part of the country, this is called in a church a pew. Lectern, where we read the Bible from, and a pulpit, which church leader, usually the vicar, can teach from the Bible. But like I said, I don't really use that very much because I like being much closer to the people. So that's just an idea of an introduction to what we have in a church and what we find in a church. And I've emailed your parents, your grown-ups, the second part of this PowerPoint, and that goes on to think about why people actually go to church. And I'd like you to look at that PowerPoint with your grown-ups and then answer the questions at the very end of it, which asks you to think more about what it means to belong to a church family, and also then to write down any questions you might have, you might want to ask. You can ask me about belonging to a church and why something's happening in a church and why is this here, why is that there, and why do we do separate things. And if you get your grown-up to email me those questions, I'll be very pleased to read them out and give you my answers. I'll answer your questions, anything at all you have to do with churches. So really that's all I want you to do this week. I want you to look at that because it's quite a bit more difficult about the reasons why people do things together in the church rather than just thinking about what the objects in the church are. So try and think and ask your grown-ups to help you with it. Write your answers, and any questions, please get your grown-up to email me them and I'll answer those next week. Now, I want us to end today by thinking of another way in which Jesus started the church, and that's the night before he was crucified. He had supper with his friends, his disciples, and we call this the Last Supper. And in this Last Supper, Jesus took bread and he took a cup of wine and he passed them round to his disciples, and he said, every time you meet together, do this in memory of me. And he said the bread is like belonging to Jesus' body, that we all share in that by all eating it. And the wine is like Jesus' blood. Jesus' blood, which only the next day was shed on the cross. And we think about belonging to the church through that crucifixion. But it's the actual Last Supper that we remember when we have a service in church, that we take bread and we take wine. And people who belong to the church come to the front and take that bread and take the wine and all share that common meal together, just as Jesus shared the common meal with his disciples. And that's why when you're confirmed, you'll be able to receive bread and wine at those special services. And different churches at different times call these services different names, but it's all the same. It's all the same service. It's just some churches call them different names. We tend to use this word, which is Eucharist. So in St Francis and Emmanuel, we would say we celebrate the Eucharist on most Sunday mornings and invite people to come to share bread and wine. And people who have been confirmed come to the front and receive bread and wine. But anybody else is welcome to come as well to receive a blessing. And this is another word that's used for that service, a mass. You might come across in some churches. Holy Communion is another way of talking about the service. Communion in the sense of community, that we all share in that meal in a sense of community. And some churches call this the Lord's Supper. And obviously that remembers the Last Supper Jesus had with his disciples. So I'm going to read you now the account of the Last Supper, or the Lord's Supper, the first Holy Communion, in Matthew's Gospel. So this is the Last Supper, or what's called the institution of the Eucharist, the start of the Eucharist, which we carry on in our churches today. And you'll find this in Matthew chapter 26, verse 26 to 30. So Matthew 26, verse 26 to 30. So as ever, please do read this in a modern version if you have one at home, or if not, just type that into the Google search engine and get something like the Good News Bible, New International Bible, something which uses modern language. and read that for yourselves. I'm going to read it to you now, and then I'm going to, as ever, give the 5-question quiz. So if you don't have a piece of paper and pencil or a pen already, pause the video and go and get one. And then finally, I'll give you the task for this week. So here we are. Matthew 26, verse 26. While they were eating, Jesus took a piece of bread, gave a prayer of thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. "Take and eat it," he said. "This is my body." Then he took a cup, gave thanks to God, and gave it to them. "Drink it, all of you," he said. "This is my blood, which seals God's covenant, my blood poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink this wine until the day I drink the new wine with you in my Father's kingdom." Then they sang a hymn and went out to the Mount of Olives. Right, so 5 questions now to see if you've been listening to that and how much notice you took of it. So, question 1. What did Jesus do after he took a piece of bread? What did Jesus do after he took a piece of bread? Question 2. What did Jesus do after he took a cup? What did Jesus do after he took a cup? Question 3. What did Jesus describe the wine as being in the cup? What did Jesus describe the wine as being in the cup? Question 4. Where did Jesus say he would drink new wine? Where did Jesus say he would drink new wine? And question 5. Where did the disciples and Jesus go after they sang a hymn? Where did the disciples and Jesus go after they sang a hymn? Okay, if you're ready to mark your answers, here are the answers. Question 1, gave a prayer of thanks. Question 2, gave thanks to God. Question 3, my blood. Or you can have a bonus point if you also said, which seals God's covenant, or for the forgiveness of sins, or poured out for many. So there's the potential for 4 points for that question. Question 4, his Father's kingdom. And question 5, the Mount of Olives. Right, so if you've got all those right, you can carry on. If you didn't, you've got to listen to the whole thing again and do the quiz again until you get it all right. And finally, here's the task for this week. I want you to find out the names of all the disciples present at the Last Supper. Find out the names of all the disciples present at the Last Supper, and then get your grown-up to email them or text them to me. So there's different ways you can do it. You can look in the Bible itself, you can search online, but there's many different ways you can find out the names of all the disciples present at the Last Supper, how many there were. That's great. So thank you very much for watching this video confirmation class vlog tonight, or wherever it is you're watching it. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you're enjoying these confirmation classes. We do look forward to the time that we can meet together again. But until then, we'll carry on these confirmation classes so that you're ready to be confirmed as soon as we possibly can do that. So thank you for watching and goodbye.